because they were asleep at the wheel, you ended up having Russian accounts being able to use, I think it was like $19,000 worth of ads to build out an audience that was contacting half of all Americans.
That clip you just heard was from my conversation with Frances Haugen. Welcome, everybody, to another amazing episode of The Hopeful Majority. If you're new to the show, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we have very interesting conversations across lines of, yes, political differences, where we talk to people that are different than ourselves to get a better understanding of the world. And today, I've got on Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen to discuss the impact of social media on polarization, on mental health. And importantly, if you're wondering more about what she did and what the goal of this episode is, I'm just going to read you the title of her book, The Power of One: How I Found the Strength to Tell the Truth and Why I Blew the Whistle on Facebook. That's the question of the show. Why did Frances blow the whistle on Facebook? With that, let's get into the rest of the conversation. I'll catch you at the end of it. Frances Haugen, welcome to the Hopeful Majority.
Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
So right before this, we were talking about, the question of tech, question of policy, and how that impacts youth behavior. And I think that the best way to start this conversation is actually to read the subtitle of your book in 2023, which was How I Found the Strength to Tell the Truth and Why I Blew the Whistle on Facebook. So my question is, why did you blow the whistle on Facebook?
It's interesting. I would say if you polled the average person in the U.S. who even knows my name, like I'm not presuming that I'm a big enough of a D-list celebrity that people would know my name in general, they would say that's the nice lady from Iowa who cared about the kids, or who showed that Instagram was intentionally harming kids or knowingly harming kids. But the reason I came forward, and the reason why I brought forward 22,000 pages of documents to the SEC and Congress, was because I was working on issues around social stability, around communal violence in some of the most fragile places in the world. And I realized that not only had I come into the project completely ignorant about what was the true power of social media, but that there were very few people in the world who actually could adequately communicate what kind of mess we had gotten ourselves into inadvertently. So I had come to Facebook in 2019 intending to work on preparing the US for the 2020 election. My title was Civic Misinformation. I was a good, Eurocentric technologist. Of course, that would be about our election, of course, right? And I showed up and I found out I was going to be working on misinformation anywhere in the world where there was not third-party fact-checking. And third-party fact-checking is kind of that, the Hunter Biden laptop boogeyman kind of thing, hiring journalists to do fact checks. The reality is that program, even though it was pitched as like, this is the primary line of defense for Facebook, only covered a very, very tiny minority of users in the world. And of the users it didn't cover, those users were much more dependent on Facebook than people are in the United States. Like the English language internet is the richest, most vibrant, most diverse, has the most options of any internet in the world. For lots of languages, the vast majority of content that exists online only exists on Facebook. And that was something that I didn't even really appreciate until I worked at Facebook. So I came forward because when I joined Facebook, there had been one round of large-scale communal violence. That was Myanmar, caused by Meta's products, by Facebook. By the time I left, there had been two large-scale acts of violence. So Ethiopia had unfolded, which had far, far, far greater impact than even Myanmar. And what I saw was that this was not the end of the violence. This was likely just the opening chapters of a really, really dystopian novel that is still unfolding today. And that I knew that if I didn't at least try to get information out to the public, that I knew I was going to be laying in bed in 20 years, having watched not like the third or the fourth round of violence, but the 15th, the 16th, the 20th round of violence play out, knowing that I had been complicit in some way, right? And so I came forward because unless the public had information, I didn't see how we were ever going to course correct from that future.
And how long had you been in that role before you came forward?
So I was at Meta for about 2 years before I left.
Mhm.
And due to the nature of how chaotic Facebook is, I worked on, I think, 4 separate projects over that 2 years. So I worked on
Mm.
civic misinformation for 3 months. Then my team got shifted to work on narrowcast misinformation. That's misinformation directed at specific people or specific small groups of people, which we could talk about because it's pretty
Mhm.
terrifying when you think about it in detail. Um, and then I moved to something called influence modeling, which was, can we identify influential people based on signals on the platform? Because they're often the ones that get targeted with things like narrowcast misinformation. And then the last 8 months, I worked within the threat intelligence team at Facebook,
Mm.
trying to find people who were weaponizing the platform for espionage. So these are largely nation state actors.
And there's a very specific phrase you used, and I'm sure you've thought about this
Mm,
very deliberately, which was that Facebook that caused some of that violence in a place like Myanmar. And you use the word cause, which I think
mm,
is
yeah.
probably a lot of the folks at Facebook, I'm sure, take a lot of issue with. Could you dive into that a little bit deeper and why you
So
draw that causality?
I feel no qualms on that one because the United Nations put out a 250-page report in 2019 detailing all the ways in which Facebook was negligent and contributed to that conflict. So
Mm.
for context for your listeners,
Yep.
you know, sources like the New York Times have done very detailed reporting on the amount of effort that the Myanmar government invested in building out their assets for information warfare against their own citizens. So going back as far as 2020, you had military officers out of Myanmar being sent to Russia to learn how Russia set up information warfare infrastructure. You know, how do you recruit the bloggers? How do you put up the dummy accounts?
Mm.
How do you have this whole ecosystem of assets that no one's even aware is actually a military resource, such that on the day that you activate it, you can make it appear that the message is coming from everywhere, that the people you trust most are saying the Rohingya are dangerous. You need to kill your neighbors to protect your own family and your children. And that's what
Mm.
happened. And
Mm.
to make it worse, Myanmar was one of Facebook's what are known as free basics countries. So they went into it in the 20 teens and said, hey, data is incredibly expensive right now. You have people who are just starting to come online. And if you use our products, your data will be free. If you use anything else other than a small number of let's call them pro-social applications like Wikipedia, some health information, you're going to pay for the data yourself. And that meant that the internet in Burmese largely centralized on Facebook. So you didn't even have the ability to turn to other spaces to seek out alternate sources of info because you didn't have newspapers setting up their own websites. You didn't have businesses setting up their own websites. Everything was centralized on Facebook. And yet there was only one Burmese speaker in the entire company. And so
Mm.
when things started really going off the rails and that person tried to get help inside the company, there was no escalation path for them to actually get information to someone who could do something. And so
Mm.
it really is a situation of, and we see this playing out with other vanguard technology companies. We're seeing it play out in places like AI, even at Meta again,
Yeah.
where people are choosing not to invest sufficient amounts of time asking, how could my systems be misused? And as a result,
Mm.
getting blindsided when they inevitably are.
It's so interesting because Francis, 2 weeks ago, I had on a man named Dan Roy, who was the chief media scientist at Twitter. You might know of his
Hmm,
work,
interesting.
and he in
Media
2013,
scientist.
2017. Yeah, I
Intriguing.
know.
What a
So
great
it
title.
was intriguing. You should check
Yeah.
out that episode to know what the
Yeah.
chief media scientist title actually means. We actually spent 10 minutes trying to figure that part out. But Deb had a fascinating insight into he's now building technologies around AI to sort of course correct some of the challenges he saw in social media. And one of the things he named was that part of the problem at an organization like Twitter and Meta was that in the early days and even now, it's hard for them to actually explain what the purpose of the technology is.
Ooh,
And so their entire focus was
delightful.
around
What a
yeah, so
great,
it
yeah,
was their entire focus was around growth, right? And so when you just use the
yeah.
phrase, which is that their technology is being misguided, that kind of presumes that they know what the guide path is for that
Yeah.
technology. Do you think that that observation speaks a little bit true in your experience to Meta?
So I think that that speaks true across society when we think about social media, right?
Mhm.
So one of the questions I don't know if you're aware of this. One of the big controversial issues outside the United States right now, particularly in places like Australia, is it's looking quite likely that they are going to ban social media for under
Right.
16s by the end of the year. And when people ask me about this, I often say like, hey, like, you know, when we're talking about the benefits of social media, we need to be really clear about what are the jobs we're hiring social media to do.
Mm.
We think of it as I'm using
What
social
is the
media
what
for
is the
a
tool
job.
or purpose it's serving? Right.
Yeah, like I spoke at a summit that was held in Australia virtually last night, there midday, and there was someone from the Department of Health that came on and said, "Hey, like we need to acknowledge the positive uses of social media. It's things like people being able to connect with people who are similar to themselves. It's being able to reach out and get information. It's being able to discover new things." And when we talk about, things being misused, right? Like that was how I phrased it. There's this question of like, what is the intended use? Are there other ways we could accomplish that same value using slightly different designed technologies? Because we
Mm.
have this presumption that social media is a stream of posts. It's a very passive experience when like maybe there's other ways that what like are we doing it to meet a social need, like to not feel
Mhm.
alone? Are we doing it because we want a sense of community? Are we doing it to mindlessly be entertained? Are we doing it to discover new concepts? We can design different kinds of experiences to accomplish different kinds of goals, but we have to be really clear in articulating what we want to even accomplish. And
Mm.
I think one of the things that's interesting, particularly about kind of where X is going, is I think the role that Elon Musk wants is he wants to have the public square. He wants us to have a space where we can wrestle with ideas or like what where the world is going. I don't know if he is necessarily succeeding at that goal. But like I would say, if he was going to try to describe what he was trying to accomplish, that likely is what he would
He has a clear
articulate.
objective. Right.
Right? But the question is that objective best achieved by a stream of posts that you have very little control over how they were generated, or like very little
Mm.
insight to is this even fair? Is it biased? And he has done, I would say, more than other places have done, in that he did publish the algorithm, which is, I think, very brave of him, given all code is bad code, or all but a very tiny minority of code is bad code. It's not just him. We're, every software engineer in the world would admit to this as well. Um, but if you don't allow access to outcome data, which he has been more aggressive in cutting off than just about anyone else, you don't actually know what the significance is of
And
those
outcome data is?
So, people always ask me like, if we just publish the algorithm, will this solve all the transparency issues?
Yep.
So, outcome data is I may think my system performs in XYZ way. I put this data in, I do these operations to it, I produce scores, or I pick out content using this process. But even the people who build these systems, when they run experiments, they're regularly surprised at what ends up being how the system actually performs. There's enough of these feedback loops between like you perturb the community in this way and it changes behavior in that way. Or even just like when you put some data in like this, because we don't actually understand how AIs think, it may
Mhm.
come to very different conclusions. And so
Mm.
outcome data is things like it used to be that Twitter published a feed of every public tweet that came across the platform. And so you could see how is the platform being used.
Mm.
You could imagine if he was really serious about wanting to be a public square, he would publish a feed every day saying, here's every post on Twitter that got more than 5,000 views. Because once it has 5,000 views, you can't really say this is private anymore.
Right.
No one's privacy is being violated. It already was violated. But then you could see things like does this algorithm give more distribution to certain kinds of ideas than others? Or in the case of
Right.
things like Instagram has come out and publicly said, we will not amplify, quote, political content.
Political content.
That's saying what counts as political content,
Right.
you
Right.
know?
So let me ask you this. So you're it's interesting because I think a lot of people would expect that your whistleblowing uh I don't think a lot of people might know that whistleblowing was a result of the conflict in Myanmar, because I think the general narrative around social media related to polarization, at least if you ask US based domestic
Yeah.
audiences, right? Because I think you've clearly outlined a difference between how social media is used in a lot of international countries that might be starving for the internet, right? Where social
Hmm.
media is a primary platform. So, in the context of the US, as
Mm.
you think
Yeah.
about the way um, that somebody like Elon is building Twitter or building X, somebody like Mark Zuckerberg is, clearly making design choice on Instagram, saying they're going to reduce political content, whatever that means. To your point, I guess the big question becomes, at least to me, how do you think about social media as it actually relates to political polarization? Do you think that there are
Mm.
specific design choices that
Yeah.
are made that
Totally.
engender
Yeah.
outrage, or do you think it is purely a result of the way that we as consumers act and behave?
No. So I'll give you some really clean examples, right? When one of the documents I brought out from Facebook was regarding uh, how they ran experiments where they said, if you communicate effectively with people different than yourselves, right? So when you post about political stuff, Facebook has a little virtual you inside where they've categorized like how far left, how far right are you? And, it's
Interesting.
shocking to think like
It's
there's
like
a
an
score
avatar.
inside of it. Yeah. And to put an asterisk by that, they had it in 2021 when I left. I don't know if they have it today. They fired lots and lots of safety people. They fired lots of researchers. They're putting their heads in the sand and pretending nothing is wrong. So who knows? They may or may not have it anymore. But back then, they had it, and they said, "Hey, people who are good at communicating with people different than themselves, they're doing actually a really complicated thing."
Hmm.
Being able to talk about hard issues in a way that yields positive conversation. And they had a way of describing, are you having a successful conversation? Is it something where like I make a post, you like my post, you make a comment, I like your comment? That's a
Hmm.
successful communication. For people who are good at that, good at talking to people different than themselves, what happens when you give those people more distribution? And it turns out, remember, this is an apolitical thing. You're not saying some ideas are good, some ideas are bad. You're saying, are you good at having successful conversations with people different than yourself? And it turns out that when you give more distribution, just a tiny little boost to content like that, you end up getting less hate speech, less violence, less misinformation.
Hmm.
But you also use the platform just slightly less, right? Because
Hmm.
probably less titillating content, right? And this is one of these things where if you had come in and said, is the algorithm designed intentionally to disincentivize content coming from people who are able to talk across the aisle? No one did that intentionally, right? But these systems, they're only optimized for what they're optimized for. If you don't
Hmm.
explicitly add in other goal functions, it will just take the shortest path to a click. And that,
So
unfortunately, is emotionally provocative content.
one of the questions I'd asked you when we were meeting was actually about the psychology of somebody like a Mark Zuckerberg, right?
Mm,
Because and it was a very
great
interesting,
topic.
actually, because after you and I had that conversation, the next 2 weeks when I was on the road, again, almost in every room, somebody raised, how does social media affect polarization? Because a lot of people will point blame at social media as one of the leading, if not primary
Yeah.
cause. And what I find hard to reconcile is
Hmm.
the reality that someone like Mark Zuckerberg started off as someone that just wanted to build something interesting in his dorm room, probably make a bunch of money out of it and make it a really large organization or company or startup. And now suddenly he has this massive civic responsibility that he never really signed up for.
And
And
doesn't want. And
and
doesn't want.
doesn't
Let's be
and
fair.
doesn't want.
Yeah.
Um how does somebody like that approach this problem set? And
Hmm.
importantly, do you think it's a rational response for somebody like that to say, "It's actually not my responsibility, it's the government's responsibility," let's say, and let them figure out the regulations and we'll just follow whatever they say? How do you rationalize his thinking around? what you're talking about?
So we know what he has said, at least explicitly, over the last year. So he's gone on quite an evolution. So in the wake of 2016, they discovered that because they were asleep at the wheel, uh, you ended up having Russian accounts being able to use, I think it was like $19,000 worth of ads to build out an audience that was contacting half of all Americans, right? Like you had people who
Yep.
really went in there and assertively weaponized the platform. And at the time, he came out and said, we made a mistake. We got blindsided. We were so focused on the positive, we didn't invest adequately on the negative. Unfortunately, in the intervening years, part of this, I think, is influenced by people like Elon Musk, who came out and said, I have to figure out how to get $1 billion out of Twitter from a
Hmm.
company that wasn't profitable before I came in and had all the
I just
advertisers.
paid 40 billion for this. I got to figure this out.
Right. I have 12 billion in loans. I have to have $1 billion in profit every year just to pay my interest. Right.
Uh-huh.
He came in and showed you could fire, and Marcus said this publicly. He showed you could rip the Band-Aid off. You could fire your safety people and there wouldn't be consequences.
Hmm.
And so we have a situation now where Mark, for a long time, I think, felt a certain amount of social pressure that he had to be, at least look like he was trying.
At least trying to achieve that civic responsibility.
Yeah. Because of what had happened in things like 2016. And he came in the more recent months, like sometime in the last 6 months, he came out and was asked, I think it was maybe in the last 3 months, he was asked at a major event, what's the biggest mistake you made in the last 20 years? And the mistake that he said was that they took too much responsibility for things that weren't their fault.
Hmm.
And I think that is just so telling, because last time I checked, when you go and hang out with your therapist, one of the major things they encourage you to do is not take responsibility for your actions. Like
Right.
that's
Right. Right.
it's
Why would
it's
you do
it's it's
that?
why would you do that? And I think part of what he's facing is, you know, he is a very unique human being in that almost no one in the world acts without consequences or feedback loops as much as Mark Zuckerberg does. He has at this point, I think it's like 57 or 58% of all the votes for Facebook because of his Class B share structure. So there's no board. He's the CEO. He's the chairman. No accountability there. We live in a country where there's complete immunity for user-generated content.
Mhm.
Only very, very recently have there been laws anywhere in the world, like places like the EU, saying that he even has to answer your questions.
Mhm.
It's one of these things where I personally have a lot of empathy for Mark Zuckerberg, because he's been denied an opportunity to grow up. He's been the CEO since he was 19 years old. This is the same man who used to have a business card that said, "I'm the CEO, bitch." Right.
Mhm.
The only people who have been around him for his entire adult life, more than half of his life now, are people that are there because he approved them.
Mhm.
Like I think he lives in a very isolated world, because just because no one can force consequences on you doesn't mean that you still live with the consequences of those
Mhm.
choices. Like, he can't really go many places in the Bay Area without people grimacing at him. He has to
Mhm.
have a huge security detail. He lives in an isolated ranch in Hawaii. He bought out all of his neighbors' houses in Palo Alto. Like, there's consequences of that unilateral lack of concern for the social good.
Mhm.
But at the same
If
time, until we pass laws that do begin to have some of those consequences, I don't think he's going to get to reintegrate into society.
and to be fair to him,
Yeah.
it generally follows the arc of the human condition,
Yeah.
right? Which is one in which, hey, I created
Totally.
something. And, like, I can point to countless examples, whether you're talking about emperors, you're talking about builders, you're talking about entrepreneurs. Um, in some ways, I do empathize, frankly, with him and his viewpoint and his perspective. So the question now becomes, as you're thinking about some of these government regulations, you're thinking about these government reforms, I can already hear somebody saying, well, what Francis really envisions is a world in which we just don't have social media, which I don't think is
Oh,
what you're
yeah.
saying.
No,
You talked
yeah,
about the binary concept. So can you talk a little bit about what it looks like to
sure.
actually have effective social media?
Yeah. We it's so interesting. Like we've lived for so long in the land of the stream of rectangles, right? Like if
Yeah.
I say social media to you, you think stream of videos, stream of square pictures, stream of rectangular pictures. Social media is a stream of rectangles. That we forget that we've had social media since like the 80s,
Mm,
right? Like the precursor to Slack and to Discord was IRC. Like we used to have servers even in the 80s that had tens of thousands of people hanging out and having conversation and having social media. But this idea that, passivity is the core of how we socialize online, I think is a concept that doesn't have to be that way.
and
Like
passivity
one of
being really just consumption. It's just one-way consumption,
Yeah, it's
right?
it's it's and it's consumption that you don't even get to direct, right?
Mhm.
Like think of one of the major conflicts with Instagram. Like people come out and say, it used to be I got to choose who I hear from. More and more, my feed is like inserted videos, reels, right? Like I don't get to choose who I hear from anymore. I don't get to reset my algorithm when I drift from what I know I am versus what you think I am, right? Like we don't have really basic consumer rights online. But I have a little empathy for Meredith Whittaker, who's the CEO of Signal, because
Mhm.
I always say, and she has yelled at me in public for saying this before, like my favorite form of social media is Signal, right?
Mhm.
I have probably
Mhm.
50 group chats on everything from like cooking to the election to one of my favorites is called Doom News, which is just
Mhm.
apocalyptic news from around the world. These are spaces that
It's
are
just a
human
good way to
scale.
keep your adrenaline going.
Oh yeah, well, sometimes you
Yeah.
need a good laugh.
I mean,
But
if you're hanging out in
yeah,
Atlantic Standard Time, you've gotta have some way
yeah.
to shake up your world.
I like to say Puerto Rico is Hawaii in a time zone where you can work. You get to hang out with the Europeans and you get to hang out with the West Coast. Like, what more can you really want? But
What more could you ask for? So really quickly,
yeah,
I wanna double down on this. You showed Signal as an
yeah.
example of social media. How do you define social media?
So for me, social media is what are the spaces that we hang out and socialize, right? Like
Okay.
I think like we've been putting too much emphasis on the media part of social media and not on the social. And like when I say like Signal group chats are my social media, like these are spaces where I encounter new and novel information. I can lean back and be entertained by my friends, like they've posted all sorts of things as I scroll through these groups. They are done at a scale that is human regulated, not regulated by a for-profit corporation. If someone steps out of line, and I've watched this lots of times, maybe someone is going through a particularly bad breakup and they start saying some things that are inappropriate or are approaching things in a way that is antisocial. You get to watch humans self-correct. We've
Mm,
had dinner parties for tens of thousands of years and no one has said dinner parties are ruining democracy.
mhm.
um, Taking a step back and saying, what are the needs that we're hoping to meet through social media? Can we do that at a scale where we're not using an unaccountable AI to sort through comments from a billion people to decide what piece of content you look at next?
Hmm.
And I think that version of social media can be very rewarding. You're just not going to stay up till 2 a.m. consuming it.
And that's the key because
Yeah.
Meta's KPI in their chart is engagement, and I'm sure Signal's KPI is
And
not
ads,
engagement, it is
right?
and
Yeah.
ads. Signal's KPI is having a secure messaging platform, right? And so as a
And
result
donations,
and
right?
donations. And so it's a different model. And so what that
Mhm.
leads to is the natural question, which is if tomorrow, let's say a Mark Zuckerberg or senior leadership at Meta decided, similarly to Elon Musk, that they're going to make their North Star something different than what it was. And let's say they said that their new KPI is not necessarily how much you consume content, but how you engage content. Let's say that
Hmm.
became the North Star. Do you think that it's something as simple as that that essentially just redirects the way that the organization's thinking about its impact, or is it something much more significant like government legislation that's required?
I think it could be as simple as like one of the things that I want to accomplish in the next 6 months is I think so. You anytime you have a single KPI, you're on a fast train to disaster, right? Like the
Mm,
real issue here is that we have systems that really can only be governed with metrics. like a big part of what I go through in my memoir, The Power of One, is just unpacking, like, how do you have a whole bunch of really kind, conscientious people who like people? Like, you don't work on
Yep.
social software unless you like people. How did these people go so off the rails? And part of it is when you reduce, and that's what having even a basket of metrics does. When you reduce the complexity of a problem to a limited number of dimensions, that's all you optimize for. And one of the projects that I want to work on in the next 6 months is, let's imagine we start out with just kids and we said, what are the 5 biggest problems regarding kids on social media? Maybe it's sleep deprivation. Maybe it's unwanted sexual communications. Like what's the 5 things we're going to just start with? And we went to the advertisers and said, hey, we need you to come out and make a public statement saying 6 months from now, you're going to start allocating 10% of your advertising dollars to platforms that are willing to publish these 10 metrics. And it's things like how many kids are online at 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3 a.m. Because one of the things that came out from the court filings where 44 US states sued Meta was that Meta had run experiments around helping kids go to bed, things like not turning on notifications late at night. But they chose not to launch that because people use the app a little bit less. In a world where you have to publish just a little bit more data publicly, you can now have different kinds of pressure give you the space to say, okay, that's worth 1% less consumption.
And you still get ad dollars
And
because
you still get ad dollars.
so it's interesting. I mean, you're essentially
Yeah.
articulating, and honestly, I think a Mark Zuckerberg would actually appreciate this, right? Because what you're doing is, again, you are taking responsibility out of their hands. You're essentially just changing the incentive structure so that
Mhm.
it creates revenue in different ways, which
Yeah.
is different than saying no social media. It's we're going to
Yeah.
shift the incentive structures to make it so that it's responsive to more productive means.
Because like part of why I really want to do this is, people talk, I think, in a lot of ways that kind of exude powerlessness about like what is our actual agency to change these things. And imagine a world where, a K-12 school comes and says, hey, what form of social media do we want to choose as a community
Totally.
to centralize on? And in a world where, there's not 5 platforms, there's 20 platforms. You just haven't heard of most of them. And in a world where platforms publish metrics, you can actually have a discussion, say, do we want to centralize on this platform or that platform? Like, what are our values? Like, what do we want to accomplish with these tools? Because remember, like when Facebook originally rolled out, they rolled out school by school because they understood the power of immediate network effects. If you can actually create a little bit of objective comparison, because right now the only thing you have to compare platforms on is marketing messages.
Right.
In a world where you have even a little bit of data and the advertisers can squeeze that data out there, they also say, hey, we're going to allocate a little bit more fuel to these other platforms because likely the other platforms will move before Meta does.
So let's actually take this 6-month project to its completion, right? Let's say there's a world
Mhm.
in which advertisers allocate 10% of their dollars to platforms that publish data according to the 10 different,
Mhm.
data metrics you want to
The
see.
initial
Like
10
the
metrics. One day we're
initial
going
10
to get to
metrics.
100 metrics. Yeah.
Okay. Oh man, the 100 is I'm curious about that list and
Mm.
what goes on that list.
Yeah.
But let's take 10 for a quick second. Honestly,
Sure.
let's say they did 5, okay? Um
Sure. Sure. Sure.
what
Sure.
what is the world nudging closer to in your view?
Ooh.
What does
It's
success look like?
Success looks like, in the short term, it's things like how many kids show up for school so sleep deprived that they can't focus,
Mm,
right? Like right now, 30% of teenagers say they're on screens to midnight and later most school nights. Like that alone is, we don't see it, but there is a $1 trillion liability, multi-trillion dollar liability down the road of kids. One, you don't sleep enough as a teenager, you have long-term chronic health problems at higher
yep.
rates. You have higher rates of mental illness. You have decreased academic performance. Like we have this giant unfunded debt that is just invisibly coming down the pipeline. So that's one thing that's really simple and meaningfully changes that.
It's childhood health.
It's childhood health. The second is around just norms, right? Like one of the things I always point out to people is like it used to be we received a whole bunch of free social education in the form of sitcoms. People used to watch, there were a limited number of TV channels, even when we had just cable, still a limited number of channels. And every time you watch, a situational comedy and you watch some guy give his wife a bowling ball for their anniversary and hijinks ensue, you learn maybe you shouldn't give your wife a bowling ball for your anniversary. Like, that's not a thoughtful
Mm-hmm.
gift. And you
Mm-hmm.
get a little piece of social education. Right now, because there is so little media that accurately reflects what children are experiencing online, and it really is children, right? As of 2021, the University of Michigan's National Health Study said 30% of 7 to 9 year olds are on social media.
Wow.
In these spaces, if you don't get education from watching Netflix, from watching your Hulu Plus, Disney Plus sitcom, where some kid gets an unwanted sexual communication and they say,
Mm-hmm.
that's unacceptable, right? That's abuse. When an adult sends you that image, that's abuse. If they had shown up at the playground and exposed themselves, they would go to jail. If you're not getting that social education in different spaces, and kids aren't, when you talk to 12, 13-year-olds, they say, this is the cost of being online.
It
And
reinforces norms.
one of the meaningful things that would change if they had to report, go poll your under 16-year-olds. How many times in the last week did they receive an unwanted sexual communication? The answer in the US, at least as of 2021, was 1 in 8 girls between 13 and 15. So they got unwanted sexual communication in the last 7 days. 1 to 2% of girls said they got 10 or more unwanted sexual communications, right? We don't, again, in terms of these unfunded mandates, when you socialize children that they should accept being abused, that is a consequence we are going to live with going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these real things where reporting even a tiny bit of data, giving them the incentive to try to do the right thing, clean these things up. Because guess what? It's not a lot of adults sending lewd photos to children. It's a very small number. We could very quickly clean these things up if we chose to. The world changes in meaningful ways, but the vast majority of people are not interacting with children. Even the employees of Facebook, the vast majority, these are engineers, these are the designers, these are the data scientists, the product managers, they don't have a child over the age of 11.
Yeah. That was such an interesting point that you had made to me that as you're just about to say, I think, which is,
Yeah.
Mark Zuckerberg, his kids
I
are,
looked
what
up
is it?
today. His
Yeah, what are they?
oldest kid is 8.
Yeah.
Adam Mosseri, head of Instagram, his oldest kid is 8.
Right.
So it's not just that they're not living with the consequences of their products. They're not seeing their kids' friends, because that's where they're actually going to start facing these consequences. They might keep their kids offline. They might be like, oh, until my kid's 13, they can't be on social media, which is their official line these days. Even though, like we said, 30% of 7 to 9-year-olds are on social media. They're going to start seeing the consequences from their friends' kids, unless, like many rich people, they send their kids to schools that don't allow smartphones, that actively discourage social media, or even send them to boarding school, because more and more rich families are sending their kids to boarding schools that don't allow smartphones or social media at all.
Yeah, I read that I think it was Eton. Is that the
Yeah,
name of
Eden.
the
Yeah.
boarding school in the
But
UK that
there's
bans?
multiple in the US also.
Yeah, so this is really fascinating input on social media and its effect on young people, and it seems like that's sort of where you've staked out a claim that you think you can make meaningful impact and difference in the next 6, 10, 11 months, right? The other area that I often hear a lot about, Francis, on the road is social media and its impact on the political atmosphere in the country.
Oh,
And
yeah.
specifically the
100%.
fact that social media, and you mentioned this, that the algorithm incentivizes a certain form of outrageous engagement that keeps you going, right?
Mhm.
And on this front, people often make the argument, the counter argument, which is, well, social media, when it also didn't exist, the United States was also polarized. And I think Mark Zuckerberg makes this argument a lot too. He references studies
Yep.
that show that polarization is relatively stable, irrespective of social media, and yet the temperature's really turned up. So, what are your thoughts as it relates to social media and polarization?
Sure. So this is one of these interesting questions. And so part of what we lose by not having a way to really teach how social media works anywhere
Uh-huh.
other than inside these companies, right? Because we have so little access to data, is that there's a lot of what I would call like the physics, right? Like the intuition around like how do these systems work that is missing from average conversation. So the wrong question to ask is what's happening to the mean or median polarization. Because remember, we only need 2% of the population on the streets to have a revolution.
Yeah.
Right? That's the classic law. 2% of the streets, you have a revolution. The question is, every single harm, every single kind of behavior on social media follows a power law. So what does that mean? The median user does not use or the 99th percentile user doesn't use twice as much social media as the median. They use 10 or 100 times as much social media. Let's say you or I might open up our phone and look through 20 or 30 posts and call it a day, right? But the 99th percentile user looks at 2,000 or 3,000 posts. The Atlantic did a wonderful article back in, I think it was 2021, where they went and looked at, they had access to usage data. There are these panels where they'll bring in 20,000 volunteers and have them send back all their social media traffic. What they find is that, the 99th percentile looks at 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of content a day. They're on there for 12 hours. We see this for people who live in more geographically isolated places. Maybe you have health issues. Maybe you don't have a lot of money. Doing things in person or outside your home costs stuff. This is a really accessible way to get some socialization and entertainment. But what we find is the people leaving comments on posts who are looking at 2,000 posts a day are usually very angry comments. There's lots of all caps action going on.
Yep.
And what we
2,000
forget,
posts a day, by the way, is a
I
crazy
know.
amount of information that you're consuming.
And when we do a lot of studies on people who are doing that level of consumption, there's a certain level of dissociation. So it's kind of like it's
I
an
bet.
ambient thing that gets conditioned into you. You might only notice the most extreme posts, which ends up reinforcing these cycles even more. And so the issue, I think, is this question of, are we creating spaces that, one, push people towards radicalization, even if it's only 5% of the population? Are we providing tools that reintegrate people who are starting to drift away? Do we give them controls where if they feel like they're getting to a place they don't like, they can reset? Like, one of the top things I think we need to do as a country is develop a consumer bill of rights for technology. And one of those things should be the right to reset your algorithms. I occasionally open up, I'd say once a week, I open up YouTube in an incognito tab because it has really fun videos. It's like dropping bowling balls off of dams and like shooting arrows through weather balloons and it's silly stuff. But it's one of these things where our algorithms get really, really overly personalized. And what we've seen in a lot of different contexts is because these systems are what is known as content agnostic, they can push us towards more and more extreme content. And I'll give you one quick anecdote, which kind of makes really vivid what does that mean in a more concrete way. I did an interview with a journalist who had just had a new baby, maybe 2 years ago. And he said, Frances, I've had this really weird experience on Instagram. Can you please explain it to me? So, brand new, adorable, happy, healthy baby boy. Modern parent makes an Instagram account for the baby. It has maybe 5 happy baby friends. These are just other friends of his that have had children as well. The only content he's clicked on is cute, happy, healthy babies. Only things he's put likes on, cute, healthy, happy babies. And yet, about 10% of his feed was suffering children. It's kids in hospital beds with tubes coming out of them, kids who've had catastrophic accidents, kids who have deformities that look really painful. And he said, Frances, how did we get from cute, healthy, happy babies to suffering children? And the reality is the computers don't understand the meaning of the content they're showing you. All they know is that for someone who likes babies, they can't scroll past this content. They dwell. Things like even our dwell time, these subconscious actions end up influencing the content we get to consume.
Right.
And so I think the question on polarization is, if we were looking at the 5% of the population that is the most politically radicalized, do these systems help reintegrate them into society, show a lot of mixed viewpoints, or does it keep showing more and more extreme content? Because that has serious consequences.
That's a fascinating view on the 5% because I oftentimes actually challenge people. And in some ways, I actually place a lot of responsibility on us, the consumers, because ultimately we're also the ones that are sharing the crazy article, right? Like, there's a reason why good news just doesn't just get traction. It's because we love seeing crazy stuff. And part of it is we want to share it or like it, or even just spend more time on the view page on our phone. And so the algorithm says, this person likes some of that. And yet, even if we changed our behavior, which seems like it goes against human nature, you're saying that irrespective of that, if 5% of the population is still radicalized and they're very vocal, that you live in a world where it's the tyranny of the five. And as a
Where we
result,
shoot at the president twice in 6 months, or the
right,
former
right,
president.
right, right. Hmm. So in the last bit of time that we have left,
Because I'll give you
yeah,
one more little example, and this is one that
please.
comes out of the Facebook files.
Yeah, yeah.
So one of the projects I worked on, I talked about narrowcast misinformation. It was this
Hmm.
question of like, how do you catch a campaign that is trying to target, say, police officers? Like that was one of the real groups that we caught the Russians targeting. Part of why we got pulled off of working on international issues to working on domestic issues was sending misinformation to people with guns. Turns out it's a problem. And how do you do that? And the solution we came up with was we went and developed a model for segmenting society based on who are your friends, what groups do you belong to, what topicality of content do you engage with, what do you produce, what do you share, all these things. And we divided up the United States into 600 what we called communities. And we intentionally didn't label them. We didn't say you are middle-aged white guys in Wisconsin, you are 18-year-old Black women in Atlanta. We didn't do that. We just said you behave in similar ways and interact with people in this cluster. When you look at where the COVID misinformation was sent during 2021, or at least when this analysis was run, 80% of the COVID misinformation went to populations representing 4% of the US population. So most people didn't get much COVID misinformation, but a small number got tons of it.
Right.
And when I point out, like, what is the consequence of that? When people stormed the Capitol, one of the common things that you heard from them in interviews was, it was all I saw on my Facebook feed, right? Like these experiences people are having are not uniform. In the case of COVID misinformation, the reason people showed up with guns at school board members' homes, at teachers' homes, was because they saw Facebook feeds that were flooded with, these people are trying to hurt your children. Right. And so we need to be really careful. And Mark is particularly guilty of this. It doesn't matter what the problem is. Like he said the same kind of things around kids' mental health. He'll say, the average child is fine. It's like, okay, the average child is fine. But your own people have said to the Senate, 4 out of 5 kids are fine. That means 1 in 5 kids are not fine. Right. We have to think about these things in terms of distributions and in the idea that we are all interconnected. And that when we let these systems pull people in rabbit holes, a very small number of people can destabilize society.
And it's interesting. Part of the reason why those people in the COVID case are pulled into the rabbit hole is not even because of the way in which they're engaging the platform, but the algorithm is saying they're going to be fed the way in which they're acting. So within their own bubble of people.
Yeah. Or how the product is designed. So I'll give you an example. If you're a member of a mom's group, and this group, usually the consensus is COVID vaccine is not a good idea. And someone posts, hey, my child just got diagnosed with cancer. They're going to start chemo. We're thinking about vaccinating the rest of the family because our kid is so vulnerable. I'm agonizing over it. What do you think? And that post will get flooded with angry comments. You're saying like, don't do this, blah, 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 blah. And every one of those new comments makes it a new post. And so it's not that the discourse ends up being able to self-neutralize. Because of the design of the product, that post will show up over and over and over again in your feed because because of the design of the product.
So I think the best way to end this conversation is actually to ask you a question that I love to ask people that have dedicated a lot of their time to a cause that they weren't necessarily interested in the first place. Because obviously, you weren't like, jumping out of your, bed in Iowa being like, I'm going to be an advocate against the company that I might be working for. Right. And so I particularly ask this question of like presidential candidates as well, because a lot of them will claim that, they weren't always seeking the candidacy and yet they feel called to this. And so the question is very simply, what is your why? Like, why do you do
what a
what
great
you
question. Yeah. It's interesting. Like, my usual one I say is like, I have a very simple mission, which is to not be needed anymore. Right. Like I really believe
I can relate.
I always say like, I live on the beach. Like if I showed you what the view is out my window, like every time I get on a plane, I feel like a crazy person. But the situation is, I really believe in the democratic process. Every time we've invented a new communication technology, it has been a shit show, right? It didn't matter if it was the printing press, it didn't matter if it was a radio, it didn't matter if it was the telegraph. Like the telegraph had serious consequences.
Sure.
Little bips and bops, and it could still be destabilizing. But the thing that's happened every time before is we have learned and we have adapted, and we've figured out how to integrate it in our lives in ways that have improved our lives. And the challenge right now is that we have a very weird thing going on, which is there are not a lot of people in the world who have ever gotten a chance to even touch these systems, let alone work with them at a level of depth where they understood how they worked or understood how you could change them.
They're simply just passive consumers.
There's passive consumers, and that's because this is the most powerful industry for the level of opacity that it is in the world, right? Because we're talking about there's probably hundreds of people, like not 500, not 800. We're talking 200 or 300 people in the world who really have like the depth of expertise that I do in terms of talking about these systems. And that's just because the only place you can study them is by working at one of a very small number of companies. And you have to be one of these weird people where you really love quantitative systems and you really like people. And those are usually not the same populations. And I don't think we are going to have good democratic governance of these systems until there is at least 100,000 people who have like a similar level of fluency that I do, right? Because when we talk about regulating cars, there's 100,000 automotive engineers who can have an opinion and can say like, that's true, that's not true. What if we did it this way? What if we did it that way, right? When we talk about agricultural safety, we have at least 100,000 agronomists in the world. Or, water pollution, we have at least 100,000 environmental scientists. That's how you actually have a democratic process. And we don't get a choice to not fix it, right? Like this is going to be, I think it's an existential issue, right? Our ability to have a functioning information environment is going to determine whether or not we get to have a democracy in 50 years. Because authoritarian countries are much more effective with technology from a governance and stability perspective. Like they're willing to acknowledge these things are powerful and they have influence. And they're weaponizing open societies today with them. And so, I have to say some of the movement we've seen in the last couple of weeks around social media has been incredibly heartening to me, right? Like Facebook has come out and voluntarily offered to do a variety of things that I thought they would never do without having TikTok be forced to as well. Things like lockdown, whether or not like the visibility of accounts for kids under the age of 16. If you're under the age of 16, you can't now just have a public account willy-nilly. You have to have.
This is their IG teens, right?
Yeah. And I think that's happening because the lawsuit, I think they're gonna have to settle the lawsuit. Like I'm willing to take odds on that. People can write to me.
Just really quickly, because I know we're so short in time, but I have to ask you: do you fear a similar problem of the lack of people that can have a real conversation about a system like social media? Do you see that same problem at an even higher scale with something like AI?
It's interesting. AI, I think actually, when we say AI, AI is so many things, right? It's going to be integrated into so many little corners of our world. A lot of the worst consequences of AI, at least in the near term, are very simple, right? They're going to be things like bias and just like systems not working very well. And people aren't going to need that complicated a level of fluency to be able to actually have meaningful conversations on like, how should these things run? I think part of why when I say like we have this big problem with social media is, when we think about physical architecture, we send people to college for 4 years to get undergraduate architecture degrees and then 3 years for graduate school. And then we make them do more licensing after that because the design of our physical spaces changes how we relate to reality and each other. And the same is true of our digital spaces. And yet we don't really have even the ability to take multiple classes at the undergraduate level on if I make this change versus that change, what's the consequence? And that's what we need if we are going to shift so much of our political discourse, our personal discourse, onto these digital spaces. And so that's what makes me get up and keep working on it is we shouldn't accept that the world can't change. We shouldn't accept that we will always live in a world of streams of rectangles, right? Like we can have nice things, but we will only get to have nice things if we fight for them.
Hmm. Well, Frances Haugen, thank you so much for coming on the Hopeful Majority. And importantly, as we always say, if you disagreed with something that Frances said,
Hmm.
the goal is actually let's utilize social media in the comment section in a productive
Mhm.
way. And please note that because that's how we have a conversation. So I really
Yep.
appreciate your time. Thanks for being so generous with it.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much to Francis for joining the Hopeful Majority. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. If you really appreciate that conversation on YouTube, like and subscribe on Spotify, Apple, leave a review. I found it really interesting. I mean, when I think about the question, why does somebody blow the whistle on Facebook? And importantly, when we go back and forth on the positive impact of social media, the negative impact of social media, I think this was a really nuanced conversation. As always, if you have feedback, send it my way. I'm always curious to hear because you and I together are going to build this hopeful majority. People that are trying to, believe it or not, have civic dialogues across lines of difference. I'll see you next week, friends.